Okay, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. You guys just heard from me, so I'll spare you an introduction, but Isaac Rowlett, Public Agenda. That's all you need to know. So before we begin, I just wanted to share a couple comments. I wanted to first acknowledge, before we even begin, some of the limitations about the terminology. This is a conversation that emerged during our lunch conversation, and it's something that is important to acknowledge up front, which is the limitation of these terms community, whether you're describing evangelicals or from the faith tradition in which I was raised, Jews, perhaps Jews in particular, are very heterogeneous, right? And scientists are the same. So and it gets even murkier when we discuss these terms philosophically, religion, right, or science. That is not going to be the focus of our conversation today. Our focus of the conversation, just to reiterate, probably you've heard this now the 100th time, as Dr. Wiseman spoke about, we're talking about human beings. We're talking about scientists. It doesn't matter if you're a chemist, a geneticist, a social scientist, psychologist, what have you. We're talking about scientists, and we're talking about people of faith backgrounds, right? As well as those who are, like myself, not a member of either community. But specifically today, we're talking about people who are of religious backgrounds and people who practice science as a profession. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our panelists. We're then going to be talking about some of the challenges, right? I think we've heard enough today. Hopefully you've heard enough about some of the status of issues between these, for lack of a better word, communities, right? Between groups. Then we're going to be talking about some of the opportunities for improving dialogue. And then we have a very long Q&A. So David Bullard from AAAS is handing out postcards. You guys should know, not postcards, index cards. You should know from your sessions earlier today. Please jot down your questions on those. David will collect those and bring them up to me. I'm going to be facilitating our Q&A after we hear from each of our panelists. And without further ado, let me introduce them. So from your right to left, we have first Sarah Pulliam-Bailey, who is a religion reporter for the Washington Post, covering how faith intersects with other areas in life, including politics, science, and culture, or issues like same-sex marriage, the environment, and poverty. Her husband works for ESPN's Grantland, and when they're not doing journalism, the Baileys can be found playing board games. Next, we have Eugenie C. Scott, the former executive director of the National Center for Science Education, a not-for-profit organization of scientists, teachers, and others that work to improve teaching of science as a way of knowing, the teaching of evolution, and the teaching of climate change. A former college professor, Dr. Scott is an internationally known expert on the creationism and evolution controversy and is called upon by the press and other media to explain science to the general public. The author of Evolution vs. Creationism, an Introduction, and co-editor with Glenn Branch of Not in Our Classrooms, Why Intelligent Design is Wrong for Our Schools. She is the recipient of numerous awards from scientists and educators and has been awarded 9 honorary degrees. That's 7 more than me. Okay, next, Ian H. Hutchinson is professor of nuclear, is that nuclear or nuclear? Sorry. Professor of Nuclear Science and Engineering at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His primary research interest is plasma physics, especially the magnetic confinement of plasmas, or ionized gases, seeking to enable fusion reactions, the energy source of the stars, to be used for practical energy production. He and his MIT team designed, built, and operate the Alcator CMOD Tokamak, an international experimental facility whose magnetically confined plasmas with temperatures reaching beyond 50 million degrees Celsius are prototypical of a future fusion reactor. Following undergraduate education at the University of Cambridge, his graduate studies as a Commonwealth Scholar at the Australian National University, involved in experiments on one of the earliest tokamaks to operate outside the Soviet Union. In addition to 200 journal articles on a variety of plasma phenomena, Dr. Hutchinson is widely known for his standard textbook on measuring plasmas, Principles of Plasma Diagnostics. He has served on numerous national fusion review panels, on the editorial board of Physics of Fluids B and the New Journal of Physics, and was editor-in-chief of the journal Plasma Physics and Controlled Fusion. He is a fellow of the American Physical Society and and of the Institute of Physics. Dr. Hutchinson is also the author of a computer program widely used for web publishing and mathematics. He has written and spoken widely on the relationship between science and Christian faith, and is the author of the 2011 book, Monopolizing Knowledge: A Scientist Refutes Religion-Denying, Reason-Destroying Scientism. And last, but certainly not least, we have Jay Labov. He was a senior advisor for education and communication for the National Research Council and the National Academy of Sciences. He has directed or contributed to 25 National Academies reports focusing on undergraduate education and teacher education, advanced study for high school students, K-8 education, and international education. He directed a committee of the NAS and the Institute of Medicine that authored Science, Evolution, and Creationism, and oversees the NAS's efforts to confront challenges to teaching evolution in the nation's public schools. He oversees efforts at the National Academy to work with professional societies and with state academies of science on education issues. Dr. Labov is an organismal biologist by training. Prior to accepting his position at the Academy in 1997, he spent 18 years on the biology faculty at Colby College in Maine. He is also a Kellogg National Fellow, a Fellow in the Education of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which you may be familiar with, a Woodrow Wilson Visiting Fellow, and a 2013 recipient of the Friend of Darwin Award from the National Center for Science Education. In 2013, he was elected to a 3-year term beginning in 2014, in which he will serve as chair-elect, chair, and past chair, it's a lot of chairs, of the Education section of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And in 2014, he was named a lifetime honorary member by the National Association of Biology Teachers, that organization's highest award and recognition. He received a National Academy's Staff Award for Lifetime Achievement in December 2014. Okay, so we have a fantastic group of highly esteemed, intelligent, and wonderful people who I've now gotten the chance to meet over the last few days, hours, and minutes, respectively. And I'm just going to establish a couple ground rules before we go ahead and get started. So, a reminder. This panel is a reminder for you guys in particular, also for all of you, but the conference is not intended to resolve big questions or come to a consensus. Instead, the goals are simply to increase our mutual understanding, appreciation, and respect for one another. As a result, there's a few ground rules. One is we're going to ask you to keep comments brief, right? They already know I'm a stickler on time, so they already know they have some timed segments here at the beginning. Second, I'm going to ask that you don't interrupt others, including during the Q&A. We'll have a chance I'll keep things moving and I'll help facilitate to make sure everyone has a chance to participate. And for all of you, participate by sending me your questions, right? So just to reiterate, for those of you who might have come in a little bit late, write down your questions on an index card. David may have stepped out for a minute, but oh no, he's right here. If you need an index card, go to him. Also, if you have one, give it to him, and I will answer those questions shortly. So actually, this is perfect. We are right on time. Our goals are to explore the challenges for constructive dialogue between scientific and religious communities, again, in scare quotes, and to identify and explore opportunities for constructive dialogue between these communities as well. So first, we're going to begin with you, Sarah. From your perspective, what are the greatest challenges to constructive dialogue between the scientific and religious communities?
Thanks for starting us off. So as Isaac mentioned, my husband works for ESPN, so he deals with sports and culture at Grantland. And we always talk about the similarities between sports and religion. You know, there's an event on Sunday, and then you cover it. And one thing my husband always says about sports is he loves that people don't tend to take it seriously, even though serious topics come up. Right, in the NFL this past year, we've talked about concussions, domestic violence. These really serious topics get snuck into these very, people see it as sort of trite topics when it comes to sports, even though it is, more serious, and people do take it very seriously, almost like a religion. But I think when it comes to sports, when it comes to religion and science, as opposed to other areas like religion and politics, you have two different groups who are making very serious truth claims, and so how we get to truth is sort of at stake, right? So there's an interesting tension there between who gets to give truth claims and how do we get to those truth claims, and I think there's a fundamental tension in trust. Who do we trust? and society in general, I think religious leaders and scientists both enjoy a level of trust among just people in general. They're even, they're polarizing maybe, but there's still a sense of you've been given this position because you've worked, you've gone to seminary, or you've gotten certain degrees, you've studied this, so you get you get sort of almost an automatic level of trust. But then when the two come in conflict, it's hard to know, where do you stake your claim, where do you stake your sides? And so I think that's why it's so polarizing. And so when you have issues where science and religion can come into conflict, not necessarily they don't have to, but they can be seen as that. Maybe it's in origins or life ethics, embryonic stem cell research. When those seem to come in conflict, that's when people start to take their sides. And I think that's where some of the challenges tend to kind of crop up, if you will. And so I outlined in talking with, I'm friends with people at Biologos and some scientists, and I love hearing where do they see some of the challenges that crop up when they're trying to reach religious communities. And I talked to a couple people before kind of putting together my thoughts. And one person told me that she felt like there's some prevailing stereotypes between the two groups. There's some attitudes about religious communities or some attitudes about scientific communities. So when you're dealing with prevailing stereotypes, it's hard to overcome those to really get at what are the issues at stake when you're assuming certain things about the other side. So the first might be prevailing stereotypes. And then the second might be a lack of knowledge. So, or you have sort of religious communities going rogue and trying to do science on their own without the context or the methods that science upholds. So that lack of knowledge or that lack of experience, that lack of science can be another one. And then the third one is, I think this is a big one, lack of personal encounters between religious communities and scientific communities. Often they, I feel like in general, this isn't just in religion and science, people in general are becoming more and more specialized in their fields, and they're not necessarily working cross-discipline and cross, religion and politics, religion and all these other areas. And so I think this is another area where you have people working, sort of narrow-mindedly, not necessarily reaching out saying, hey, what do you have to bring to the table? What can I bring to your table? And people are sort of in their own silos. And like I said, I don't think that's unique to religion and science, but I think it can be even more glaring in these areas. So those are three kind of areas that I would look at when it comes to challenges with religion and science.
Take it away.
Now, I wrote this out because if you just let me talk, I'll go much too long and he will yell at me. So bear with me. We're asked to consider challenges to constructive dialogue between science and religion. I think a big challenge is getting scientists and non-scientists, whether they are people of faith or whether they're non-believers, to recognize the strengths and limitations of both science and religion/philosophy. I put the /philosophy in there because there are theistic religions, there are non-theistic philosophies, like humanism, that also need to be part of the conversation. Specifically, the question from Elaine's survey, quote, scientists should be open to considering miracles in their theories and explanations. 60% of evangelicals said yes. Professional scientists, whether believers or non-believers, balk at this, and for good reason. There may be scientists who believe in miracles, but very few of them would claim that you could study them scientifically, and let me explain why. Think of science as a limited way of knowing. It's limited in two ways. It's limited to explaining the natural world, the world of matter and energy, which is a very big category. But not all questions people want to answer are questions of matter and energy. Is Michelangelo better than Caravaggio? That's a matter of aesthetics, not science. Should we let parents withdraw medical care from children? Science may inform that decision, but it isn't primarily a science question. Questions of meaning, what's it all about questions, those are also not science questions. That's really the bigger set. So science is limited to understanding and explaining the natural world. Secondly, science is limited to using natural explanations. We don't use miracles to explain why something did or did not happen if we're doing science. If the new fertilizer on the corn plot didn't result in a larger crop, we don't say, because God didn't want it so. We don't assume that God has stock in Monsanto, whether or not that is true. This is not because all scientists are atheists. It's because of an important limitation of science. Science is first and foremost a procedure or method of finding out about nature. Its most important element is testing of explanations against empirical evidence. You know about testing. You've seen plenty of commercials. Does Tide get out stains better than brand X? If the salesman for Tide on the commercial has two shirts, one stained with carbohydrate and the other with oil, he's got two washing machines, one old and not rusty and the other brand new, uses hot water, a long soak cycle, and the heavy agitation cycle on the shirt washed in Tide, and cold water, the gentle cycle, and half as much detergent in brand X, you're going to say, hold it. It's not a fair test. To be a fair test, you have to hold constant everything except the kind of detergent, the type of stain, washing machine, and all that sort of stuff. Otherwise, you can't really say that Tide gets the stains out better. So the reason scientists limit themselves to natural causes is because those are the kinds of causes that can be held constant. An omnipotent God cannot be held constant. God is unconstrained. You can't keep God in a test tube or put him in one. So scientists leave out miracles when doing science, simply because we have no ability to hold constant the actions of God. If we ever invent a theometer, we'll reconsider it. But for now, if you're going to call it science, you have to leave God out as an explanation. But to quote the philosopher Rob Pennock, to say nothing of God is not to say that God is nothing. If your tax preparer says that she is using Quranic bookkeeping and will pray that your numbers will be accurate, you'll probably direct her to use standard accounting methods. The IRS would doubtless prefer this. But to say nothing of the Quran is not to say that the Quran is nothing. A challenge I see is communicating to non-scientists this methodological naturalism and distinguishing it from philosophical naturalism, the assumption that nature is all there is. Similarly, scientists, especially ones who are non-believers, need to recognize that science is supremely good at answering questions about the natural world, but is not in itself a philosophical system or worldview. Science is a way of knowing about the natural world. It can inform religious and philosophical positions, but it is not in itself a philosophical system. It's an equal opportunity substratum for theistic and non-theistic views. We can have a lively discussion about whether the observations and explanations of science better support some theistic or non-theistic views than others, but we shouldn't confuse the institution of science with systems of thought that consider different phenomena from the matter and energy universe that is science's strength. So I see a big challenge in recognizing what science does best and what religion/philosophy does best, and rendering unto science the things that are sciences, and rendering unto religion the things that are religions. When you think of it, religion gets a bigger slice of the pie. It gets the most important stuff, which does not mean that science cannot inform religion and that religion cannot inspire scientists to ask new or different questions. But those questions, like all questions in science, have to be put through the ringer of empirical analysis and testing. Miracles are essentially outside of science and cannot be and should not be, both because doing it is a science stopper. You stop looking for a natural explanation if you can invoke a miracle. And from the theology side, it's the God of the gaps. But if 60% of evangelicals believe that miracles should be part of science, that is a task for both science and theology to tackle. Sorry, I went over.
Oh, and keep those, if you have questions, write them out on those index cards and get them to me. I'll give preference to ones I get earlier, so.
Thank you very much. I find myself surrounded by two former recovering professors, and I'm not even recovering. So I've written out my remarks too, and I'm just a workaday scientist, so perhaps that's the best way to do it. I am a workaday scientist. I'm also a follower of Jesus Christ, and I can affirm the Nicene Creed without perjury. I consider myself to be born again and indwelt by the Holy Spirit. I regard the scriptures of the Old and New Testament as being inspired by God and profitable for teaching, reproof, and correction. And I seek to live my life under the lordship of Christ and in fellowship with him. And I think that there are good reasons for believing the Christian message to be true. And as a physicist, I also value very highly the scientific understanding of nature. I'm persuaded by the overwhelming scientific evidence that the Earth is roughly 13 or 14 billion years old, and I won't be precise like Deb Harsma, and the Earth is a few billion years old. I'm not an expert in biology or genomics or natural history, but the evidence for the central role of natural selection and common descent in biology seems to me enormously strong and getting stronger. And I don't find those two strands of my belief, the Christianity and the science, to be contradictory. I've been both a Christian and a scientist for more than 40 years. And actually, that's nothing special. In fact, history is full of serious Christian believers who've made outstanding contributions to science. And so it's a matter of considerable concern to me that there are Christians who reject parts of what science has learned about the world, and that there are scientists who reject the significance of knowledge that goes beyond what science can discover. And so I'm delighted to be part of this gathering, which is striving to get beyond those stereotypes of the science and religion warfare mythology. Robert Wathnow, a Princeton sociologist, wrote in 1990 that in American higher education there is a prevailing, quote, disdain for evangelical Christians. Few groups are as despised a minority. Jews certainly are not. African Americans no longer are. Gays are not. Women are not. Roman Catholics once were, perhaps even very recently. And in the 25 years since 1990, when he wrote that, things have become worse. Christian fellowship groups have been banished from, for example, the California university campuses because they insist that their leaders must be Christians. The so-called new atheists have argued that religion poisons everything. Christians and others are accused of improperly interfering with science when they advocate restraints, for example, on biological research topics like cloning or stem cells. And on the other hand, strident atheists have recently portrayed their beliefs as a kind of historic stand for truth against the oppressive religious orthodoxy of American society. Now, I don't actually live in the Bible Belt, so I don't know how much truth their complaint would have in the Bible Belt, but I do find it faintly ludicrous to suppose that atheists are oppressed for their atheism in research universities today. But I'm not here to argue for the victimhood of either Christians or scientists. On the contrary, and this is my chosen challenge for our dialogue, I want to place before you a challenge that as we seek to break down some of the barriers between scientists and Christian believers, it is crucially important to set aside claims to victim status. And I know this is extremely hard to do in a moral climate which today places so much emphasis on victimhood. But I'll offer rationales to the two communities represented here based on your beliefs to justify this move of setting it aside. For Christians, if we sometimes are victims, our suffering is not worth comparing with the suffering of our Lord, nor of the glory that is set before us. And for scientists, I would say, natural science is not so weak that it is going to fade away because of misunderstanding or misrepresentation. It doesn't need to monopolize either the epistemic field or the political field. It's more robust than that. And so in both communities, let's set aside the rhetoric of victimhood, the harping on slights and misunderstandings and injuries, and instead look for common causes. Thank you.
Thank you. I had some remarks prepared, and then Professor Eklund spoke this morning, and I threw it all away. So I wrote on here, and what I want to do is talk about some challenges that have come up that are a little different than what have been talked about here, and then in opportunities come back a little bit to what Jeannie was talking about. I had a deja vu experience this morning when Dr. Eklund was talking about when she was a graduate student at Cornell, and she told somebody that, you know, she was a graduate student, and the reaction was, ugh, right? And she told you why. I am a Woodrow Wilson visiting fellow. Woodrow Wilson Center is right in this building. And we have an opportunity to go for 4 or 5 days to various small colleges around the country and essentially be a scholar in residence. I'm going to be doing it next week, and actually somebody else in the audience is doing it with me. But when I was at a small liberal arts college in Michigan, I won't say which one, I went and gave a talk about evolution that this professor had asked me to do, and this young woman was in the class, and afterwards she told me, I need your slides and I need your book because I've got to give this lecture to my father. And I said, why is that? And she said, because he told me that I should not become a science major. I should not become a biochemistry major because he was afraid that it would undermine my faith. And I wanted to show him the kinds of things that I was talking about, that I'll talk about in opportunities next, that it's possible to be able to reconcile both. So one of the things that we have to be thinking about in challenges is that people are not listening to each other. They have their preconceived ideas of what's important. They have a feeling of what's going to undermine it. I talked to her, for example, about the fact that if you took a comparative religion course, let's say, don't worry about science, take a comparative religion course where you're taught about Buddhism and Hinduism and Judaism and Islam, they're not trying to change your faith. What they're trying to do is to expand your horizons and help you think about ways that people think about things differently than yourself. So it's a growing process. And I think we have to be thinking of the college experience more of that. In not listening, I'll give you a personal example, and I fully admit this. I was the person who helped the Academy produce this report called Science, Evolution, and Creationism. And at the time that we were starting, it was at the time of the Dover decision where the judge had ruled against intelligent design in Pennsylvania being considered as something that could be in science classes. I said, aha, slam dunk. We start with that in this report, say that, and what else do we have to say, right? Obviously, everybody's going to get it. But then the Academy allowed us to do something that they almost never do, and that is to actually go out and talk to people and ask them what they think. And so a couple of people in this room who have done this, we did some audience research. And for what I realized is that starting with the legal precedents made no difference to the people who are going to be reading this report, okay? And so I had my preconceived notion of what I thought was important. Academy members, after I came and actually we published Science, Evolution, and Creationism, said, look, all you've got to do is make up a couple of PowerPoints, for example, about how molecular biology has resolved all of these issues in evolution. We'll give it, we as Academy members will go and talk about this, and of course the problem will be resolved. And how naive, right? And part of the reason is that we don't understand what social science is telling us about how information and values connect with each other. And this is tremendously important, and we can maybe talk about this a little bit later because we don't have enough time. But without that understanding, and it's universal, it's not people of faith only or scientists only, it's universal. We have to be thinking about that. I think what Sarah was saying about a lack of personal knowledge of people on the quote-unquote other side. When we ask people, you know, tell us who you admire as a living scientist. Most of the people in our focus groups couldn't do that. They named their doctor, right? And they couldn't, besides Albert Einstein, who they didn't realize was dead, and Marie Curie, who they knew was dead. They really couldn't identify a lot of these folks. And so we have to begin to think about opening up our communities and having this kind of dialogue and talking with each other as we're doing here. And the last thing I'll say is that I was very much persuaded. We had this exercise that we were doing upstairs. Which of those would you choose? And the comments after Hurricane Sandy by Governor Cuomo in New York, basically, he wasn't talking about religion. He was talking about ideology and political leanings. And he said, it really doesn't make any difference whether you think climate change is human-induced or not. We've got a problem. And we've got to resolve that problem. And regardless of where you're coming from, we all have something in common of common interest. And whether we agree to disagree on the causes of it, we have to figure out how to address this so that the New York City subway is not going to flood and kill thousands of people the next time Hurricane Sandy happens, because it's going to happen. And so part of this is going to be, as this gentleman said upstairs, we have to think about education, 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 and I'll talk a little bit about that in my next part, and think about how we can begin to turn this challenge into some opportunity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all for those remarks. So now we're going to be switching gears, and you are already, here's again the pragmatist. The pragmatism is coming out, so you're already kind of touching on some of these opportunities, but we're going to dig deeper into not only what are the challenges of dialogue, but what are some of the opportunities. And we're now going to go this way on the panel. So Jay is going to start us off. Yeah.
Can we play musical chairs?
Yeah, that'd be great.
My voice is tired.
So again, from your perspective, what are the greatest opportunities for constructive dialogue between scientific and religious communities?
Okay, so I think it gets down to a combination of education and what Jeannie was talking about as one of the primary things. And education in its traditional sense will not do it, because unfortunately in science education, and we as scientists are largely at fault at this, we think that the more information you give people, the more they're likely to understand and therefore accept stuff. And typically what happens is it just glazes over. And we've heard, I've heard introductory courses in science education at the undergraduate level are like dousing people with a fire hose and hoping that they're damp about 6 months later. And so information itself is not the way to do this, and more information will not add or satisfy or solve the problem. What we have to begin to do is to help people understand the connections among different things, and therefore we have to begin to think about holistic ways of approaching scientific questions. And scientific questions are not just about the science. They're also about ethics, they're about philosophy, they're about economics, there are a lot of other things that have to be involved here. And so thinking about broadly, courses on cancer, let's say. Everybody's motivated because somebody knows somebody who has cancer. You can begin to teach the science, social science, economics, philosophy, epidemiology, policy, and a lot of other things that connect along with philosophy and religion in those courses, and begin to understand what these different perspectives might be. So we have to fundamentally change the ways that we think about what education is and what it should be and what we measure. Too often we measure what's easy and not what we value. And so we have to be thinking about that. So getting back to what Jeannie was saying, and getting back to this example of why this young woman came up to me after I spoke, this was a class at 8 o'clock in the morning for non-majors, I think it was, and I came in and I said, your professor has asked me to talk about evolution. Now I want to tell you where I stand on evolution. I don't believe in evolution. And so they kind of put their cell phones down for a second. And I said, furthermore, I work for the National Academy of Sciences for the United States of America, and the National Academy of Sciences urges scientists not to believe in evolution. So then they really put down and actually started to listen. And I said, now let me tell you what I'm really talking about. I don't believe in evolution because evolution, like all kinds of science, is not a belief system, as Jeannie was talking about. The evidence, if it's contrary to what your hypothesis is, forces you to either modify the hypothesis or to change it completely. This is different than articles of faith, where you can begin to think about, it still accepts certain things despite the evidence. We had a geocentric universe where everything revolved around us. We know that's not true, and yet people have not abandoned their faith. So there are different ways of thinking about this. Furthermore, I would tell people, as Jeannie pointed out, that we have invented nothing better as a species than science to help us understand things like the dynamics and the mechanics of the universe. But science has absolutely nothing to say about the purpose of the universe. It's not a scientific question. And furthermore, if science is an attempt at natural explanations for natural phenomena, then the supernatural is beyond science. And as Jeannie very adeptly pointed out, this is not to say that the supernatural doesn't exist. It's just a question that science cannot address and answer. So if we begin to think about what constitutes science, the processes, the nature, and the limits of science, as well as the processes, nature, and limits of philosophy and religious kinds of questions, then I think we have some common ground on which we can begin to talk about the differences, acknowledge where the differences exist, and talk about the other kinds of things where we can begin to have some common ground, and talk about how they can address issues like dealing with cancer in courses. So I'll stop there.
Thanks. Evangelicals are Christians who think that God is active in the world and has spoken definitively in the person of Jesus and in the Bible. And what evangelicals will always resist, I think, is a diminution or a denial of that revelation. And nevertheless, within perhaps the last 50 years, there has arisen in the secular academy a habit of devaluing and denying the possibility of revelation. And liberal scholarship often evaluates the Bible, even, for example, on the basis of a presumption that it's nothing but a human book and should be interpreted under the presumption that miracles don't happen, that prophecy can never be predictive, or that anything appearing to be contrary to current scientific descriptions of nature is superstition. And as I see it, the problem with that approach is not that it is scientific, it is that it is biased. It presumes a certain answer at the outset. Science does not need to assume and cannot establish that nature is all there is. Evangelicals, including many great scientists of history and of the present, deny that presupposition. Actually, naturalistic metaphysics is most prevalent in my observations, not so much amongst scientists, but among those in the non-scientific disciplines, even in, as I mentioned, Bible scholarship. And I think that's because science gets on fine with a minimum of metaphysics, whereas the human and social disciplines generally don't. Now, you may have heard commentators noting that evangelicals do not reject all of science, but instead they pick and choose the science that they accept. But I think that should not be a surprise. It's a practice in respect of the modern academic scholarship as a whole to which evangelicals are completely committed. Evangelicals will never agree that Jesus was just a great human creature and all we can know about him must be discovered based on secular presuppositions. So of course we know that they aren't going to accept everything that is served up on the liberal secular academy's menu. But here's the problem. More often than not, the latest research of studies that bear no resemblance to natural science because of their topics are offered up as if they were just as certain as the laws of physics or of molecular biology. And the reason they're portrayed in this way is in part because of the widespread belief that science is all the real knowledge there is, and that's scientism. And Jenny has criticized it already. Under scientism, the way to get your ideas accepted is to get them labeled as science. Now, this audience is undoubtedly sensitive to attempts by certain Christian activists to get their ideas labeled as science. But in fairness to them, when they do so, they're only following the prevalent tactic of the day. So here's my proposal for an opportunity to improve the communication between scientists and evangelicals. It's for both sides to deny and oppose scientism. It's to welcome and respect knowledge in the disciplines that are not like natural science, but not to pretend that knowledge shares or can share the degree of confidence and consensus that the methods of natural science give us. To talk of evidence-based thinking that is empirical and verifiable, as if it encompasses all that one can truly know, is to dismiss vast realms of human endeavor. History, sociology, economics, politics, aesthetics, philosophy, jurisprudence, and theology, but notice not just theology. Disciplines like these are not and cannot be made like empirical natural science. And if an unspoken scientific presumption leads to them being treated as if they were an extension of natural science, the result reflects more the metaphysical presupposition than reality. The inflated scientific claims of those who want to co-opt the prestige of science for their own agenda provokes the determined opposition of evangelicals, and rightly so. It should also be resisted, I think, by thoughtful scientists, regardless of their religious views, recognizing the strengths of the fabric of our knowledge of nature, but also its limitations. And I think that mutual understanding will be fostered by recognizing what science actually knows and what it does not know. And I think the task of discerning what is and isn't established by natural science needs to be shared between our communities, because it requires an understanding of both science and metaphysics. Thank you.
In my dealing over the years with evangelical Christians, which has been primarily within the creationism and evolution controversy, I have been struck that it's not really a concern about the Cambrian explosion. It's not really a concern about the validity of radioisotopic dating. It's a concern about whether their kid showing up in an evolution class is going to be taught, living things have common ancestors, take your religion and shove it, which, of course, at the K-12 level is vanishingly small. A little bit more common at the college level, but it is a perception of something that is not as big a worry as many conservative Christians believe it is. That said, it's a perspective, the take your religion and shove it perspective is not a perspective that's appropriate at all in American public schools. And I, as a recovering college professor, don't believe it's appropriate at the university level either. It's perfectly legitimate to make your students think harder about tough issues, but it's not your job as a college professor to try to change the religious views of your students. And I say this as a philosophical materialist myself. I'm a humanist. But I think our topic here is opportunities for dialogue. I would like to see a much better understanding of philosophy of science, of how science works, and really the structure of science and what makes it really work and not work. I would disagree with Ian a bit in that I see science I see science as underlain by critical thinking. Critical thinking is actually the engine of science. It's this iterative process of observation and testing of conclusions and so forth. Critical thinking is something that underlies good history, good philosophy, good theology, all of these other intellectual disciplines that Ian so articulately outlined. I think all of these can benefit from critical thinking, and as such are respectable human intellectual endeavors. Science is a particular application of critical thinking to understanding the natural world. It is a limited way of knowing. It is not hegemonic in the sense that many conservative Christians believe. So I come from the education side of things like Jay. I've got retooled in the education side of things. So I really do look at education as being a solution to the problem. We have a low level of science literacy in our country. Everybody is aware of that. We also have, what we're not as aware of, a very low level of theological literacy, of understanding of what evolution is. And I don't mean just the Middle Eastern monotheisms. My background is anthropology. When I think religion, I think of a whole lot more than Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. I think about animistic religions, I think about tribal religions, I think about the Hopi, I think about the Australian Aborigines, I think about the huge myriad ways that human beings make sense of the relationship of themselves to an immaterial universe. We as Americans don't really understand the importance of religion to human societies, much less our own society. I would love to see more comparative religion at, say, junior, senior year of high school. I think in 15 years that's something that could be developed if we start working with social science teachers and if we start working at state accrediting agencies and curriculum development. Right now, the social science teachers are scared to death to teach it for obvious reasons. The First Amendment is exquisitely clear, as Richard Katzke will underscore. You cannot advocate religions in the public schools. You certainly can describe them. You can certainly teach about them legally, and you should, because it's an important part of our understanding of what makes us human. And I think would go a long way, if we had better theological literacy, it would go a long way to helping us understand a little bit better the tensions that can arise with science and religion.
That's great. So as I was listening to, the opportunities presented, I feel like underlying a lot of this is, what would it look like if both communities presented a little bit of humility? What does that look like on a practical level? And then also, what does it look like to offer generosity to the other side of listening and really, truly trying to understand one another without ceding ground, without, giving up your deeply held beliefs about science or religion. And, on a practical level, it probably depends on what community you're talking about. But I feel like, I forget who said that people couldn't even identify one living scientist. That's pretty incredible, right? When we can identify like 1 million celebrities and we can't identify one living scientist. And so if, what would that look like for especially religious communities if they had, an evangelical scientist that they could identify, whoever it is, that they could say, like, this is somebody I can sort of look up to and maybe be someday, for their kids to be someday. I think that would go a long way in just identifying somebody who is a believer in whatever tradition, and also a scientist. That I think that would go a long way. Also, creating dialogue between, these two communities could also present, and maybe in the context of disagreement, perhaps. Maybe it is over origins or life ethics or whatever. Having closed-door, honest conversations with each other can really put a face to different issues, rather than allowing it to be, sort of in inflamed, online discussions or whatever, which I love as a reporter, but is it helpful for society? Not so much. And then also framing some of these issues as not necessarily mutually exclusive. Can some of the issues that arise when you're talking about religion and science, when they appear to conflict, are there ways to sort of work them out side by side rather than colliding forces? Because I think, it's very easy to look at the world in very black and white terms, and, it's helpful, as for me as a journalist when those, work out like that, but they don't in real life. And so, I have a deep appreciation for scientists because as a journalist, I have the same struggle of, when I'm I cover religion, and I can't look at like a Billy Graham crusade and be like, that's the work of the Holy Spirit, guys. That doesn't work in my stories. And so so in that way, I empathize with scientists, but I also see, because I cover religion and I talk to a lot of people who are dealing in theology, like, okay, help me understand how you're understanding this. Like, help me, put this in words and you know, as a journalist, I sort of have to have a humility here to hear different sides of, you know, whether it's a scientific explanation or a theological explanation, or, you know, multiple other layers of explanations for how we see the world. But, you know, what would that look like on a practical level in different communities where, you know, there's more of a real emphasis or there's a lot of work to be done in terms of hearing another side of including and listening to and offering generosity to somebody who doesn't necessarily agree with you. So.
Excellent. Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you all for, you know, we heard about the challenges. Now we've heard of some opportunities, a little bit of hope. And I've also been, while listening to our esteemed panelists, working through some of the excellent questions that have emerged as well. And feel free to hold your card up if you want David to grab it. You can always take some more. So now we're going to be tackling some of these questions. And the one I'd like to start off with, it was one of the first ones I received, I thought it was very interesting, was someone asked, why do we even need to have dialogue between these two communities? Don't they tackle different questions? And I'm curious, Sarah, if you don't mind, I don't mean to pick on you, but do you mind tackling that one?
Why do they need to?
Yeah, why do we even need to have, especially because you just mentioned it as a potential opportunity, why do we even need to have dialogue between the two communities? Don't they tackle different questions?
I don't think they they tackle the same questions through different lenses. And I feel like, and they're not mutually exclusive lenses, but I feel like if you understand, like, this is how scientists would come at it, this is how an anthropologist would come at it. Or, sorry, that's not two different things either. But
Don't say that to Jamie.
We have a split opinion on this.
Sorry. What I meant was there are different ways of approaching the same subject, and I actually think that broadens your, it just broadens your view, and it helps you understand through other people's experiences, and it allows you to become a more humble person, a more generous person, I think, to say, like, I don't necessarily have the mind of an anthropologist or a theologian, but this is how they would come at it, and I just, it broadens your view. I don't know, I don't think they're different.
Okay.
So.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to weigh in on that question? Yeah, Jeannie's like, yeah. Okay, go for it.
Is there a developmental biologist in the house? Why, I do believe I see one. I think when they try to answer the same questions of certain types, they don't do as well. Ida, if you peel sticks and put them in a water trough, will the cattle who drink from that water trough have speckled coats? No. All right. Sorry. The biblical, you all know the story I'm talking about better than most audiences, right? There's mammalian coat genetics, and then there's the peeled sticks in the watering trough. One of them actually works in terms of increasing your proportion of next generation's herd. Similarly, if you want to answer the question, is torture ever moral? A scientist or critical thinking, if you will, social science perspective might help you answer that question in the sense that it might be able to give you statistics on how many tortured victims actually provided material that was useful for avoiding whatever you're trying to avoid, but the ultimate question that comes right down is not a scientific question. So I think that by and large, although there may be some overlap, I think that scientists, if you agree with me that science is a limited way of knowing, explaining the natural world through natural causes, it's got a different job description than religion and philosophy have. Religion and philosophy have much bigger and more important issues to deal with. And science may inform them, but science itself, I don't think, deals directly with them.
So science can't necessarily answer everything is what you're saying, but can religion explain everything?
Religion sure does a lousy job explaining mammalian coat genetics. Okay. No, really. I mean, you know, we've been extremely nice to each other for the last day. We haven't talked very much about the areas where we disagree. but in general, revealed truth of a holy scripture is not going to give you very reliable information about the material world. The Bhaktivedanta Society will tell you that the sun is closer to the earth than the moon is. Therefore, the moon landing was a hoax. Now, should we teach this to our fourth graders, or should we teach standard scientific cosmology about the positions of the solar system, planets and Earth? The reason why the Bhaktivedanta Society believes this is that they interpret the Hindu Vedas as showing that the position is the sun, the Earth, the sun, and the moon is way the heck out. Now, that's their revealed truth. It doesn't do as well as the many hundreds of years of scientific experimentation and observation that shows us that the proper relationship is that the sun is in the center of the solar system and the moon revolves around the Earth. When, skunk at the picnic here, when
One more, and then we're
people
gonna
try
hear
to
from Jay.
use revealed
She
truth
hasn't recovered
to
much.
when people try to use revealed truth in the Bible, the Quran, the Vedas, pick a sacred source, to explain the natural world, by and large, they don't do very well.
Okay, Jay, I know you had signed
Yeah,
something.
I just want to take a slightly different tack on this, because ultimately, even though, the question is, why do people need to talk to each other, science and people of faith? And I would say because we all have common problems, and I think we can help each other. For example, the National Academy of Science, National Research Council published a report called A New Biology for the 21st Century back in 2009. And what it said is that biology will be to the 21st century in science what physics was to the 20th century in answering the big questions. But the fact that biology and all of its new tools and the fact that it's moving ahead so fast at a breathtaking pace can do all of this if we actually want to use the information in ways that can solve large societal problems. And this is ultimately what I think we have to be thinking about. There's obviously basic research that people are doing, and it's under attack because it seems to be frivolous. I'm directly against that approach, because basic research is important for basic knowledge, but it's also important because we have no idea what it's going to lead to 10 or 20 years from now. All right, but the point is that if we want to be thinking about what science can do, science contributes to these issues, but it can't resolve them, it can inform. And so we have to have a meeting of the minds of people talking about these things and understanding the value of science in trying to think about these big societal issues. We at the National Research Council offer all kinds of recommendations to government on how things should change and what policy should be. But without having other kinds of perspectives, the costs, the social perspectives, possibly religious perspectives, all of these things come into play in making a final decision on what policy should be. Science is part of it and needs to be a critically important part, far more, I think, than it is now with some of the folks up on the Hill. But when we think about problems, these are holistic and science can inform, but it cannot necessarily dictate what has to be done. On the other hand, knowing what the science is telling us, of people who are not scientists and understanding how the process of science works so that they understand how we got to these answers and these conclusions can be critically important in the kinds of decision-making that we do.
Okay. Ian, you didn't.
I think we
you
should
don't need to
move
weigh
on
in.
because I think we pretty much all agree we should be, it's an important topic.
Excellent. Okay. Moving on. All similar lines here. Someone asked, someone said, finding common ground is a common theme for this conference. However, as Jeannie Scott said, science only deals with the natural world. How do scientists convey the importance of scientific inquiry through a theological lens? It calls you by name, Jeannie, so I'll allow you to take that one first if you want, or else you can.
Well,
point it.
I think a religious person would be a better person to
Okay.
answer that.
I'll
frankly.
take it. First of all, I wanted to say that I agree with almost everything that Ginny has said, okay? And I actually don't even think that there's the disagreement that you suggested, because I think that critical thinking is terribly important in all kinds of areas. So I actually think we agree on a great deal. But I think that this question of a theological lens is one which is historically quite important within the scientific enterprise. The people who originally got science going, as we know it today, modern science, in the 17th century, were largely people of faith. And the science that they talked about was embedded in all kinds of descriptions that had to do with their theology and philosophy as much as it did about their science. Now, of course, we've moved on. We've reached a different place in the way we talk about science. But it's still the case for those of us who have a theological perspective, who are Christians or who are theists, that we see the natural world as a creation of God, that we see the wonders of the natural world as something to give thanks for, not just in a vague sense, but actually to give thanks to the Creator for. And that's, I think, a crucial part of science for us. I don't mean to say that secular scientists don't have their own wonder. They do have. And it's a wonder that we share together in a kind of common humanity. But it's certainly a disappointment to me if we are not able, as Christians, to celebrate that sense of wonder. Let me also make a couple of comments about the question of the value of scientific study, which I would express a little differently at any rate from the way Jenny said it. I mean, I think that from a Christian point of view, there is a long history of valuing the study of nature, of the given world, on its own account, by its own, interpreting it by its own viewpoint. In fact, the whole idea that Christians have had for hundreds of years, that God has revealed himself through two books, the book of God's Word and the book of God's works, and that these are both valuable and ways in which we can get to know God. Those two things are both valuable. And so I can understand, and even appreciate the thought that, if we want scientific, technological answers, we'd better do it by the study of God's works rather than by the study of God's Word. But Christians say that the study of both is valuable in their own ways.
Okay. One of the common themes that's emerging in the questions is, what do I do? Right? What do I do about this? So we can have these fantastic conversations about these issues, both in theory, but in practice. I'll give a concrete question that I'm curious. Any of you are welcome to jump in on this. A lot of attention is paid to the big, tricky, controversial questions. But how can someone who carries out this work of more mundane science contribute to dialogue between science and religion?
There's some interesting research on compliance with medical treatment. You tell people they should take so many pills a day at such an interval for so many weeks, and how many of them actually do it. What was found is that you got much better compliance with a very low-tech kind of thing. You don't really need monitors, and you don't need cameras in people's houses and all. It's just having somebody come by and visit, somebody call you up, having an actual human being to talk to increases the compliance with medical directives enormously. It was a very interesting couple of studies showing this. And I think that kind of person-to-person connection is important in just about every endeavor that you can think about, including the dialogue, multilogue between scientists, people who are and are not of faith, and the religious communities. If you are I forget exactly how the person described themselves, but it's just a run-of-the-mill
Mundane. Yeah, this is a bit self-deprecating.
An ordinary
scientist
scientist people who are doing all the work, really. Talk to the person in the supermarket checkout line. Talk to your neighbor. Talk to the people in your church. Talk to the people. Mention, oh, I'm a scientist. I do such and such. People don't know that you are a scientist. People don't know what you actually do. cultivating these person-to-person kinds of relationships is probably the best thing we can do, ultimately. Because it appears to be the most effective, at least those are the data we have.
Great. Any other suggestions?
Yeah, I would say modeling what dialogue looks like, particularly at the university level, because too often what we see in the media is confrontation rather than true dialogue. And so, for example, it was pointed out that before I went to the National Academy of Sciences, I was a professor at Colby College in Maine. Every January, we had a 3-week term, and one year I took 18 students along with a colleague in religious studies, and we went to Israel for 3 weeks, and we studied biology, and we did some archaeology, and we talked about, ultimately, how did people deal 2,000 years ago with the climate in the Negev desert? And so we looked at the biology, we looked at theological issues, we looked at social issues. We began to talk about these things in ways that were respectful, that understood that each of them had something to contribute. And while they may be different approaches and different ways of thinking, there are ways that they can be melded. And I think too often students simply don't see that kind of dialogue going on. Now, I fully understand, since I work on higher education, that requires 2 full-time equivalents for a class, rather than just 1. And the dean is not going to be all that excited about doing it. But there are ways that you can begin, I think, to ask people to your class and talk about these things. A colleague here at Georgetown University for a first-year seminar has been doing for the last several years the historical confluence and differences between science and religion over the last several hundred years. And then I came in and talked with them about some of the modern issues that are going on with things like evolution and stuff. So he allowed his students to be exposed to respectful dialogue. And I think too often we're simply not modeling that, and I think we can go a long way. And that can be at the level of your neighbor, as Jeannie was saying. It could be at the level of your classroom. It could be at a higher level. And it can be in a seminary.
Yeah, I'm a workaday scientist and a professor. I was marking problem sets on the plane coming down. I also do a great deal of speaking to university audiences predominantly about this topic of science and faith. And I do it, a lot of it, in dialogue or conversation fashion. A lot of what I do is done through the auspices of the Veritas Forum, which is a Christian organization that tries to foster the discussion of religion and, let's say, intellectual life on campuses, because they think it's very important. And they get groups, for example, Christian fellowship groups on university campuses to band together, invite speakers, get an organization like that going. In fact, I've done 4 such conversations in the last 6 weeks at different places, Colorado, Ohio, various places. The most remarkable thing about those conversations is the intense interest on the part of students on these topics. Intense interest. Of those 4 things that I've done in the last 6 weeks, 3 of them had over 1,000 students come to this conversation. Of course, partly that's the promotional efforts of the students at their local universities, but it also, in my view, shows the hunger for this discussion on the university campuses today, and the extent to which it is not being met. And so that's why I'm so happy to be a part of that organization, and I want to encourage this dialogue too, because I think there's a tremendous hunger amongst young people for it.
Sarah.
I was going to defend the media when you. So unfortunately, dialogue is not very sexy, right? For a headline, it's just not a sellable article. It really isn't, legitimately. But what is sexy and what does sell is innovation. And so whenever groups are coming together to form some sort of cool solution to the world, that is a cool story, right? So anytime that I think science and religion can come together to create something cool, like, I don't know what that looks like. Maybe there's some science that you can do to solve poverty or whatever. Like, if you can do some things together that create cool stories, people resonate with that, and not just the media, right? Like your community will resonate with that. So maybe there are conversations that maybe a religious community says, "Hey, our local, we're having trouble with this issue. We're having a homelessness problem. We're having a problem with home or with poverty, whatever it is, environment." And then bring in scientists and say, "Can you do something? Can you help inform with your scientific knowledge? Can you bring any tools to the table that we can sort of harness our communities together and create some cool collaboration?" That's a cool story, right? Those are stories that people can get behind, and they may take dialogue. They may have some conversations within communities. But whenever you can come up with practical solutions, people really resonate with that, and that's one area I think that the two groups can come together and form some sort of interesting collaboration.
Great. Okay. So dialogue isn't sexy. That's a buzzkill for me, I
Sorry.
gotta tell you. Okay. What if we frame innovative dialogue?
Yeah, no,
Okay.
but
It's all good. No, it's a
the word in and of itself is like, okay, now we're gonna go to sleep, but innovative dialogue makes it a little sexier.
innovative dialogue. Okay, we're time for public agenda to rebrand. Okay, this question is for Ian. Why do so many evangelicals resist interpreting Scripture non-literally? And how do we cause a shift in this resistance among them?
Okay. First of all, the quick answer is I don't know. But let me say a little bit about it. I mean, I do think, and I alluded to this in my opening remarks, I do think that evangelicals feel a little bit embattled in respect of Bible interpretation. And that there is a sense in which evangelicals define themselves and are defined by the fact that they don't take a sort of secular liberal view of the Scriptures. And so there's kind of a natural impulse to go to the opposite extreme. But I think that natural impulse needs to be resisted, because I think that it leads to distorted interpretation of the Scriptures, in my opinion. And I think that there are tremendous resources that exist within the Christian communities, within the history of Christianity, that can help us to adopt a more balanced view. But I mean, the simplest way, I think, to help people to come to a more constructive way to approach the Scriptures is first of all to recognize that the Scriptures are not a scientific textbook, and never were and are not intended to be, and God doesn't intend them to be a scientific textbook. I think that's point number one. Second thing to say is there are within even very much the evangelical communities approaches to understanding the Old Testament, particularly Genesis, and the early chapters of Genesis, of course, are the most fraught, that are much more constructive and actually much more true in a certain sense to the Scriptures than a literalistic, scientistic type of interpretation. So quick answer is I don't really know, but here are some ideas.
Okay, great. Sarah, did you want to?
No, I thought he
You got it.
articulated it
Okay.
well.
Okay. Sounds good. Jay, this question is for you. Given that there are many organizations dedicated to undermining science or sowing seeds of doubt in science, how might scientific institutions respond? And the example provided as a possibility question mark is a marketing campaign, an innovative marketing campaign.
That's a multifaceted and multi-level question. So at one level, scientists, for the most part, are completely unfamiliar with communication, have never been trained to do it effectively. And many of them don't like to do it. And trying to ask them to do it very often there are no incentives, no rewards, no recognition for doing so. This is beginning to change. I've been at AAAS annual meetings, for example, for the last couple of years, and it's very clear that graduate students are far more interested in trying to figure out how can they communicate more effectively about the science that they're doing. So I think this is beginning to change. I think also that people in the scientific community and elsewhere are unfamiliar about what the social science is telling us about how to look at these kinds of issues. The National Academy of Sciences for the last couple of years has had major symposia on the science of science communication. And there's something to be understood through social science research about these kinds of things. So for example, when you look at the Gallup poll, let's say, for the last 4 decades, where it appears that absolutely nothing has changed when you ask people, do they say that God created the world in its current form, or that evolution, it's always about 44% saying that God created things in the last 10,000 years. And so what the interpretation of at least some scientists is, well, these people are stupid, But so many of them have gone through your courses. So what are we doing wrong to help people, or that are preventing people? Bruce Alberts, who was the former editor-in-chief of Science and the former president of the National Academy of Sciences, when he looked at the videos that we did on science, evolution, and creationism, from our focus groups, he came away and said, I've just come to the realization that many people see science as another form of revealed truth. And the reason for that is because we teach science as telling and conclusions rather than as a human process. So we need to be thinking differently about how we help people understand science, both through the courses that we teach, through the teachers that we educate, who are going to be going into K-12, and in the ways that we think about reaching the public. The other thing that is becoming very, very clear from recent research is that if you reframe the question of the Gallup poll to saying, do you believe, where scientists say, well, people don't understand anything about evolution, if you simply reframe the question to say, do scientists say, and give those 3 options, then many people will say, yes, scientists say that, that things have evolved through natural causes. So it's not that they don't understand or don't have the knowledge. What we're finding, however, is that virtually everything that we do, whether you're a scientist or anybody else, information is filtered through your value system. And your value systems can be very different, but they're there. And if information that you receive is incompatible with your value system, you very often challenge the information. So providing more information is not going to be changing that. And so, again, this gets back to what we were doing upstairs. Do you want A or B or whatever? And my comments about Governor Cuomo. Research has shown that if you ask people, you teach them something and you give them a test, and you then see what they've learned about it, if it's a non-controversial topic, regardless of your religious perspective or your political ideology, people come out pretty much the same on how they answer the questions. But if you give them a topic, like, for example, in the United States about climate change, what you find then is it human-induced. What you then find is that people are very polarized based upon not only their political leanings or religion, but also their level of education. And it turns out counterintuitively that the more educated you are, the more likely you are to be at the polarized extreme, one way or the other. And because I know, I learned all the facts, so therefore I know what's going on, and therefore I can be very confident about that. Now, in England, in England, if you ask about climate change, pretty much everybody's the same regardless of their political leanings. If you ask about genetically modified foods, you come out with exactly the same kind of thing. So there are some real insights that social science is telling us that we're not following that can begin to help us think about the ways that we can begin to overcome some of these issues by framing things in ways that are not necessarily controversial to people. And then that can begin to get us to lead on and begin to work together.
Yeah.
So, I wanted to make a comment with sort of backing this up in a certain sense, but pushing it in a different direction. And that is, I think we're often offered a kind of contrast between what the commentators will call faith-based thinking and evidence-based thinking, as if, basically that there are religious approaches to the world and there are somehow evidence-based approaches to the world. And obviously in the academy, we're offered the evidence-based approach as being the best. But the fact of the matter is that, while it's true that the average person in the pew takes their religious views basically on authority from their religious authorities. It is just as true that their scientific views are a reflection of their scientific authorities. And so for most of the people in the population, this difference between faith-based and evidence-based actually doesn't really exist. It's not functionally operative. And actually, I don't really think that that stark distinction or dichotomy really exists at all, because I think most people who are religious believers think they have some evidence for their beliefs. It's just that the evidence that they have for their beliefs is by and large not scientific evidence. And so it's only if you're unconsciously adopting a viewpoint which says it's only scientific evidence that counts, that you can really make this kind of dichotomy. And I'd like to urge that we move away from that kind of thinking, because I think that would actually be valuable for both sides of this discussion, and it would help scientists to understand how to communicate to the general public more, and it would also help people of faith to understand where they stand.
Okay. So Jay, you brought up teachers, K-12. These issues aren't controversial enough, so let's throw in some K-12 issues here. One of the questions we got
Bless you.
was about teacher prep and teacher education. So, and just for the record, we got about 7 minutes left here, so let's keep our remarks kind of short so we can get to a couple more questions. The question we have is, all too many K-12 teachers have little knowledge of the nature of science, or they tend to propagate the factoid memorization paradigm in which they were taught. How should teacher training be changed to better enable educators to develop a deep understanding of the nature of science?
It hedges on introductory courses and at the university, because particularly for teachers who are going to be in K-12 in elementary and middle school, many of them will never go beyond introductory courses in science to take this. So the question I ask when I go and talk with faculty after I lay out all of the issues that are going on things like climate change and evolution, and science faculty get really upset about this, I said, but all these people have gone through your courses. So the question is, what is it that's really important for people to know and be able to do, let's say 5 years after they get out? I would contend that it's probably not getting people to memorize all the reactions of the Krebs citric acid cycle for cellular metabolism, or memorizing a lot of other stuff. It's helping them to understand, what does science do, what can it do, how does science work, and then you can put in any kind of content that you want about that. I talked about the fact that we did a report called Evolution and the Nature of Science. And in retrospect, I think we got the title backwards. This was written for high school teachers. Evolution and the Nature of Science, it really should be the nature of science. And then ultimately, how do you use things like evolution to help us understand how science works? Because if you look at evolution, it's like virtually every other topic if you're thinking about the scientific approach. We're using the same kinds of tools, the same kind of thinking, the same kind of analysis in evolution or in understanding climate change, predicting into the future, as we do for most other kinds of things.
Okay. Any other comments on teacher preparation?
Yeah, if you really want your students to understand science as a way of knowing, you don't do the lecture on science the first week of class, okay? And then never darken its door again. What you do is you run the nature of science through the entire semester. Every week, when you talk about some aspect of whatever your discipline is, you mention, and the reason we know about that is because so-and-so did this and that, and this is the experiment that showed it. Really illustrate to the kids, just saturate the students with the idea that science is a way of knowing that requires testing of ideas. We don't just pull ideas out of our hats or some orifice. We have to test our ideas in order to have them accepted by our peers. But students just assume that, a scientist gets a list of facts when he gets his PhD and that's the end of it. Similarly with evolution, if we want students, for those of you who are biologists, if we want students to understand the importance of evolution in biology, then we have to bring evolution into the entire semester, not just the unit on evolution.
So I wanted to make a couple of comments about education at the K-12 level. Actually, I have the PhD level covered, and my wife teaches preschoolers, so we've got the two ends of the spectrum covered between us, but it's what happens in the middle that's the problem. You know, I actually slightly disagree with Jenny's prior comment of probably 3/4 of an hour ago. So I just wanted to, I think it's probably the case that most teachers are much more sensitive to students' religious commitments and don't tell them to take their religious beliefs and shove it. But somehow or other, it is the case, and I think this is a great concern to evangelicals, that in many public schools, students do get the impression that you've got a choice. You can either be religious or you can believe in science. And I think that does concern Christians, particularly evangelicals. And I think that actually is the biggest problem in our K-12 education vis-a-vis this particular discussion. Yes, science is terribly important. All of us here, I'm sure, agree we want the American public to understand science better, and I want to support that. But I do think that some of the difficulties arise from a perhaps unintended impression that that dichotomy that I just put forward, you know, either you're religious or you're scientific, is present. And I think that's something we need to get away from.
Okay, so we got 2 minutes on the clock. Here's what we're going to do. Lightning round, 30 seconds each. You get a final comment. What I'd love to hear, and there was a common theme in some of the questions we didn't get to too, is building off of this, recommendations you have for people, what to do next, what follows this type of conversation. But if it's something else, that's okay too, but I am going to keep you to 30 seconds each. Jay, go ahead.
All right, so my 30 seconds is a shout out to Rick Potts to walk 3 blocks down to the National Museum of Natural History and go to the Hall of Human Origins. Because despite, in addition to all the incredible stuff that they have there about human origins, every exhibit says, how do we know this? What's the evidence? I've never seen anything to this degree. It's critically important that you take a look at it, and I think it'll give you some very important insights.
26 seconds, beautiful. Ian.
Well, thank you, first of all, for the invitation to be here. It's been tremendous time in this panel and in the workshop as a whole. I think that somebody, I can't remember who it was, called out the most important thing that I think is part of this discussion, and that is simply humility. None of us understand all of these problems. None of us all understand all of science. None of us understand all of theology. None of us have a perfect knowledge of what is what. And therefore, that humble listening approach is perhaps the most important one that we need to foster. And that doesn't mean setting aside our convictions. We don't enter that with an abnegation of our convictions. We bring our convictions, but we listen humbly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ian.
I can't even get to the verb in 30 seconds.
I know it.
You have 10 seconds left.
I spend a lot of my time being yelled at, either by some conservative Christians, but also by the more enthusiastic atheists who don't like the fact that I am a non-believer, but I'm not an anti-believer. I think we need to turn down the gas on a lot of this exchange. Be civil to each other, be respectful of each other, and listen to each other. And try to figure out where people are coming from. Some people are going to be wrong about stuff, but it's called a dialogue or a multilogue because we're supposed to be speaking and listening. And I think if we all just need to try harder. It's that person-to-person connection.
Okay, thank you, Jane. Sarah, the last word.
Yeah, I would go back to what I said about creating your own stories. You know, creating dialogue within your communities, whether it's innovative dialogue or something else. you can create stories that don't necessarily get picked up by the mainstream media, whatever that is. You can create stories that resonate within your communities. They get picked up on social media and they get spread. They don't have to be, like I said, picked up by traditional media. But if you create those stories, people will latch onto them, and then they will start thinking about the issues that you're touching on as you're creating that innovative dialogue.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, well, let's give a huge round of applause to our panelists. Okay, well, that concludes our session, and I believe, I'm just confirming, we are all returning to the ballroom B, which I believe is the main room, for some report outs on challenges and opportunities from all of the sessions. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah.